Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of our conference. It will be a little bit of a hybrid panel with some of the speakers being present here in the room and with some of the speakers joining us online. And without further ado, I think I will just immediately introduce the first paper of this panel called Solidarity Among Illiberal States. And it will be a paper by Hadas Aaron, who is based here at George Washington University, written together with Emily Holland from US Naval War College. And the title of their talk is All Bark, No Bite, a systematic analysis of illiberal behavior in the international arena. And just looking at John and at our speakers, if Hadas is here, yes, I think Hadas, if you hear us, please do take the floor over. The word is yours.
Yes, I do hear you. Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting us, and thank you to a very, very interesting keynote. I'm really sorry we're both not able to be here, but Emily's also here, and I will share my presentation, and which, of course, I can't find. Oh, there it is. And begin. All right. So this is a slightly different title than the one we envisioned. And one of the interesting things for both of us, I think, is that we've been working on questions of the behavior of illiberal leaders in the international system for a while. And the thought that we always had was that, yes, there are certain things that illiberals do in the international system, but these things have become much more bold in the last few years and extreme. And one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, why is that the case? And why is there such a quick, in a way, such a quick escalation of the behavior of illiberal leaders in the last few years? This is not a full explanation. Actually, it's a little bit of an explanation and a little bit of a test case to understand what is happening, in our opinion, in the relationship between liberals and illiberals in the world at the moment. So we ask ourselves, why have illiberal leaders become more emboldened in the international system? And we see this behavior for many of them. Certainly the behavior of China has become more aggressive, both the rhetoric and also certain economic practices. Russia, I don't even think there is much need to elaborate. Of course, has become much more emboldened, both domestically and abroad, and just a couple of, the war, obviously, and everything around it, very aggressive international relations, but also even more specifically, just recently, we think that the killing of Navalny and everything around it was a very, very extreme event. And even just this week, probably trying to subvert elections in Moldova. We don't know their interference in other cases. So all of these things are quite extreme. And then we see Hungary has become much more aggressive within the European Union and in NATO. I am in Israel currently. Of course, Netanyahu's behavior has become much more illiberal, not just since the war, actually, even before that. So, and also domestically, all of these leaders have become more aggressive. We will focus mostly on the international arena, but we do see this growth of boldness for these leaders. And we're trying to understand it through the war in Ukraine. So we think that generally, despite the initial strong response of the liberal world to the attack, to the invasion of Ukraine, we see more recently a few developments that we find interesting and also disturbing. So we see that illiberals have become more tied to each other than perhaps we expected, but certainly more tied to each other than they used to be. The relationship is stronger despite significant differences between them. We see that the leadership in the liberal world that at first seemed very strong has waned to an extent, and the most important key countries are suffering from domestic problems and suffering from leadership issues. And we see that as a result of the first two, Russia has managed to sort of evade or to persist or to evade some of the punishment that has been thrown at it. And we see that perhaps the deterrence of the liberal world is less effective than it might have been. So let's start with illiberals and what they're up to. First of all, what we see since the beginning of the war in Ukraine is that Russia and China, the relationship has become much closer than it used to be. And this is not an ideological thing, of course, but much more of a transactional relationship. The level of trade between these countries has grown very significantly to $240 billion. As a result also of the sanctions, there is a much increased China has become a very large transporter of equipment, and also Russia is exporting most of its or a lot of its energy to China. China is the biggest consumer, so much stronger relationship. We see one thing that is growing very clear in the last couple of years and increasingly almost daily is a military cooperation between Russia and Iran, Russia and North Korea. And this should not be Ukraine, let me tell you, because they're not collaborating, but this should be China, and among other collaborations. So what we see there is that Iran has been supplying drones and shells to Russia, and also actually North Korea has supplied missiles to Russia that they've been using. We see now reports on North Korean soldiers on the ground in Russia just in the last week. And there is an agreement from June 2024 between North Korea, bilateral agreement between North Korea and Russia, a defense agreement on a mutual defense. So certainly this has become much stronger, of course, than it was before the war. Then we see that there are strong diplomatic efforts since the beginning of the war beyond the West. So attempts at persuasion, especially in Africa and the Middle East, that have been pretty successful. In Africa, it's a complex situation because there is also military involvement of Wagner there, and kind of an expansion of the power or a projection of the power both of China and of Russia beyond the West. And even though there were institutions and ties before the war, again, it's important to note that a lot of these things have become stronger since the war, both because of great incentives in the Russian case, but also because of needs, specific needs, and the reality that was created after the war. Meanwhile, in the Western side of this equation, the war in Ukraine started very strong. So I'm sure you guys remember that in the beginning of the war, Biden brought back the band, NATO came together and presented a pretty strong and unified front in support of Ukraine. And that actually held to a large extent. So there is still a provision of weapons, and there is still politically and diplomatically support for Ukraine in the West. But a few things are still worrying about this Western alliance. So first of all, in terms of leadership, there are some concerns. Biden's leadership has weakened since the beginning of the war, both domestically and I think also internationally. I'm not here to judge why that happened, but I think it's pretty clear that his forceful stance in the beginning of the war hasn't been as vocal and hasn't been as persuasive in the last, let's say, perhaps year, perhaps more than a year. But meanwhile, it's not just on Biden. Other leaders haven't picked up the torch in any sense. I think the most significant case is the case of Germany, that in the beginning of the war was kind of contemplating with itself about the mistakes that were made prior to the war, leading up to the war. But since then, there hasn't really been a very significant change, and especially there hasn't been a leadership from Germany on questions of security or even questions of liberalism beyond Germany itself. And in a way, this is quite frustrating. The European case is in general quite frustrating because they had, since 2016 in the Trump presidency, a concern about what is the future of European security, how would Europe look like with a weakened NATO, etc. They haven't done much about it. And then a real crisis in 2022 with the invasion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but they still really haven't responded to it. And again, this is especially for Germany, because in the other cases of other countries in Europe, they are stuck with all kinds of domestic issues, and this is particularly France, where they're boggled down by domestic issues. And that leads kind of to the second issue, that is that domestically, all of these countries in the West have all kinds of political turmoil. Some of it is actually connected to the war to an extent, inflation, for example, in some European countries, and some of it is unconnected to the war. But there has been a rise of the far right, and in some cases the far left too. And both the far right and the far left are actually not supporters of the war in Ukraine. They have a much more ambiguous view on both Russia and Ukraine and the war itself. And so this sort of threatens the unity of the Western response. This is particularly true in the French case, where it's unclear who the next president is going to be. But there has been a strengthening of forces. Again, it's not only Marine Le Pen, it's also the far left, but there has been strengthening of forces that oppose the war. And of course, the United States, where one of the reasons we haven't written the paper yet, and we're just giving you the presentation, is that we felt uncomfortable to write this paper before the election, because we honestly don't know to what extent the problems that we pointed with leadership and unity of the West will become much more detrimental if Trump is elected. The other issue that I see I wrote here, and is indeed important, is the divisions within NATO, which is, so on the one hand, NATO was reinforced by the war, 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. But at the same time, we do see internal divisions that are kind of very similar to the divisions we see in other international liberal institutions. We see opposition from Hungary, even tougher opposition from Turkey that is playing between worlds, and to an extent now Slovakia too, that are making unified and strong decisions difficult and putting obstacles along the way. The last thing here, which I think is very important, this is something that was notable from the very beginning of the response to the war in Ukraine, which is that the West never managed to increase the response beyond the West, sorry. So it never managed to bring on board all kinds of actors that are not in the very traditional core of the West. And despite great efforts in the beginning, and that never changed. So the circle of countries that are a part of this Western unity never grew, and most countries remained out of it, playing both sides or not playing any side, but not taking part and not joining any kind of effort and not viewing themselves as part of the West, whether it's the global South or other countries that are uninvolved. So the result of this has been, as I noted, the Russia and China relationship undermines the effect of the sanctions that were put on Russia, and Putin's Russia endures. Is it doing great? No. Are the people of Russia doing great? Certainly not. But this kind of reinforces a thought that exists perhaps in the illiberal world, or at least for illiberal leaders, that they can survive and they can endure the unhappiness of their own people. And that's perhaps not the most important issue there. They can do it through coercion, like in the Russian case, or through other means, which we've seen in other cases, nationalism, internal divisions and sowing divisions, and undermining the opposition or delegitimizing the opposition, etc., etc. So we have seen that at least it gives these countries, these illiberal countries, the thought that they can actually survive. And moreover, it gives them the idea or signals to them that the cost of defiance against the West might not be that bad. Of course, it's not entirely true for smaller countries. And I do think that eventually or ultimately, the costs are amassing. But if the war is sending a signal, it's perhaps not the right signal. Having said all this, something that Zach said, which now I don't know, what is the non-French way of saying it? Bouchamp? I don't know. Bouchamp? Okay, never mind. And he was talking about, or he was asked a question about the positive or the optimistic or pessimistic stance of especially the left in fighting against this movement, etc. Now, I have always been in the opinion that it's better to err on the optimistic side on these issues, because the cost of it, I mean, of course, you need to warn, you need to be aware, But you also should or have to, if you want to fight this tendency, have to present your own positive vision. It's actually very, very important. And I think that to an extent, this is still the way I see it to an extent. Again, it's very hard to stay optimistic at the moment. But to an extent, it is important to remember that these countries are not winning. It doesn't mean that the situation is going in a very good direction, but it means two things. One, it's a struggle. There is an ongoing struggle. And to be in a struggle, you need to show up. So the West has, the problem with the West perhaps is that it has been showing up strongly to this struggle. But of course, this is not a one-sided thing. And the other thing that is important to remember is that these countries are not actually winning this struggle. They are enduring it, and they are managing to shape perhaps more parts of the world in their image, or in the case of Russia, in their image, in the case of China, not exactly in their image, but using their diplomatic and economic relationships. But actually, all these countries are struggling. China itself has economic struggles. That's not a good thing, because the way that it's trying to deal with them is going to be probably negative for both liberals and illiberals. But they are not easily winning this struggle. Also, the transactional illiberal relationships are limited, and ultimately, for example, one of the ways to view it is that China has been cooperating with Russia, but it hasn't been that helpful to Russia as it could have been, because oh, they said wrap up. Oh, sorry, didn't see it. Okay, so bottom line, the liberal order is still resilient, and I think that's important to remember. But we need to show up to this struggle, and I am done.
Please join me thanking Hadas and Emily. For the audience, please do keep your questions until the end of this panel. We will collect all the questions together for all the speakers. And I will move to the second paper of this panel that will be presented by Maria Snigavaya, who is affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as with Georgetown University. The paper is written together with Julian Waller, who is at the George Washington University here, but I think Julian will also present his other paper in the same panel as well. So I will just give the word to Maria.
Hi everyone, as always, so delighted to be here. Thank you for coming. And just a word of caution, this is very, very fresh. Me and Julian just started working on the ideas, and this is what we want to measure. But we will appreciate any contribution, any suggestions as to whether the question is right and how we can develop it further. You actually may know my work from where I study on the economic side of the populism, where I actually show that working class electorates do matter for some type of populists, including Central Europe, and the working class groups joining in the illiberal constituencies actually explains a large chunk of the popularity of these parties when they come to power. However, economy is obviously not everything that matters, and essentially we also see these parties obviously adopting a variety of positions on the social cultural dimension. And by these parties, I mean primarily illiberal parties. Here in the paper, we define them as ideological reaction to perceived hegemonic liberalism. And to go back to Zach's presentation, clearly we see a lot of rejections of the so-called liberal hegemony that they perceive. In that sense, we are different in our definition from illiberalism from, say, Hadas's presentation. We wouldn't classify North Korea or Russia as a liberal case of liberal parties being in power, given that there was no liberalism there in the first place that they're trying to reject. But the key focus here is the variation in their social-cultural repertoire. While we see them kind of embracing similar narratives, and that Brussels is bad, migration is eroding our society's vote, and national identity. What is interesting to us is that nonetheless, in both parts of Europe, East and West, these parties, actors, tend to adopt a variety of rhetorical cultural appeals. We actually broadly group those types of appeals into three groups. The first one, politics of memory, it's more widespread in the East, where essentially there's huge debates, like you can see, for example, in Poland, as to the memories, the history of these countries, how to approach them, and to what extent some of these countries are implicated in the painful legacy of the Second World War and whatnot. Those types of appeals are less widespread in the West. There is also politics of identity, which is its own thing, even if it's also related to politics of memory. There, the debate as to like identity, right? Who are we, and are we true Poles, true Hungarians, or maybe like how do we define ourselves? Last but not the least is also politics of morality. These questions pertaining to the backlash against the so-called social progressivism, and these questions actually are much more better studied in the literature on Western Europe. Altogether, if you try to link them all together, you can broadly kind of group them into at least these categories, with East Central Europe adopting a variety of positions on migration receptivism. This is what Western European illiberals have in common with them. But there's also much more pronounced appeals made on traditional family values, or politics of memory, or irredentist appeals. And so the question, accordingly, that we're trying to ask has to do with what explains this variation in appeals. Is it purely opportunistic, just because the context is more conducive to adopting one sort of appeals versus another, or there is more to it? Over time, we also have seen growing convergence between the two groups of the liberals, where Viktor Orban, and these companies will discuss this in more details, traveling around essentially, I think, is one big factor contributing to the convergence in the narratives across West and Eastern illiberals. But nonetheless, the variation is persistent. Now, of course, there are a lot of scholars who try to explain this variation, this phenomenon. Typically, and that's generally the problem with the literature and the gap that we're trying to fill in, scholars focus on the regions that they know better. Like I primarily studied the east of Europe, and many scholars instead study on the west. And accordingly, the explanations that are being offered, they are specific for local contexts. In case of Western Europe, especially Engelhardt, people, Norris, most notably have described this so-called silent revolution, the progressive liberal, social liberal change that brought about a so-called silent counter-revolution, essentially a backlash against these trends that are, things are just changing too fast. And accordingly bringing about a lot of resistance. Like just one example, if you had a chance to watch the Apprentice movie, I just found out that apparently there was a ban here in the United States on hiring individuals belonging to LGBTQI community until 1994. So it's really like, with that being so recent to some people, it's not probably that surprising that we envision this backlash. On top of that, we see this trend being reinforced by the influx of migrations. Some of the societies struggling to accept them, struggling to accept the variation in the cultures, and clearly that reinforces these trends. A lot of literature in Western European context has focused on the role of the identity politics, society structuring into smaller segments based on narrow identities. That clearly is extremely dangerous. It undermines our ability to talk to each other. The key quality of democracy is deliberation. But again, these issues are much more studied in the context of Western Europe. Now, when it comes to Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, here, on top of these previous factors that I flagged, a lot of literature is focused specifically on the memory wars that focus on the communist nostalgia, but also pre-communist nostalgia. Many of the far-right parties in the region make a lot of irredentist appeals. They adopting and creatively reshaping the legacy of the far-right movements from the interwar period, for example. And there's also the problem of the value wars. In a lot of ways, we still see the same silent counter-revolution, or maybe not so silent in this case, between the so-called modernizers and traditionalists. But we postulate that this, first of all, there is a lot of variation, right, on this topic, and then we broadly mix it together into one social cultural dimension. Second, there are various explanations that can be used for the East and for the West, and maybe it's the same trend that we are envisioning being just slightly modified, reshaped for various contexts. And that's exactly what we're trying to understand. Are there reasons to believe these common processes that are converging together, or maybe there are certain specific idiosyncratic factors that explain this dynamic? So based on this analysis, we offer a number of hypotheses from social cultural legacies of each region that maybe make it easier, more natural for these parties to adopt specific social cultural language, or composition of the electorates. I work a lot, obviously, on the working class electorates in these regions, and so perhaps the composition of the electorates make it easier to adopt particular narratives as opposed to others. There is temporal factor over time. Julian's work has demonstrated. We see a lot of the convergence going on for these illiberal thought collectives that we observe. It can be purely opportunistic also, whatever works. We see that these parties are extremely creative when it comes to their position on Russia, for example, Hadas just discussed. They can be all for Putin until then they support sanctions against Russia. So in that sense, maybe there is no particular party that one can identify, which is also very interesting. Last but not the least, there's also the incumbent status, right? We see the phenomenon of moderation of the language among the far-right parties that make it to the government. And we will have an opportunity to study this in more detail, given that, unfortunately, in Western Europe in particular, we now see many of these parties also making it to the parliament, so it's no longer the East Central European idiosyncrasy. Now we have a lot of data to work with. So what is our proposed methodology, right? It's a big question that we're trying to tackle. Also, first of all, we are lucky to have real true experts on the field whose work we're going to rely on to, first of all, explore the differences and similarities in the language, the social cultural language adopted by these two groups between two regions. But also, we're going to try and make use of the AI approaches by relying on the Manifesto Project's database in order to essentially see which particular parties are more likely to mention particular issues more frequently, using the regular word frequency count, but also the sentiment analysis, specifically with regards to the social cultural dimension. And then we will generate several dependent variables corresponding to a particular type of language. So when it comes to the politics of identity, it will be one. If we're mnemonic words, for example, it will be a separate variable. And ultimately correlate them to a variety of explanatory factors, right? Social cultural legacies are somewhat easier to operationalize. The time period and the electorates will be a little bit harder, but we will rely on our previous work, just leveraging the European social survey. That's pretty much it. That's our idea. We will be very happy to go collect any feedback, any suggestions. To what extent do you think it's plausible to focus just on one dimension? Because obviously there's all these economic issues, COVID, environmental issues, everything else going on. Maybe we are missing some important hypothesis that also worth adding to the analysis. At this stage, we'll be very happy to get any contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are moving back to online. This time it will be Petra Goasti from Charles University together with Lenka Bustikova from University of Florida, who will present the paper titled The Impact of Transnational Illiberal Networks on Domestic Politics. Ladies, please take over.
So can you see the presentation now?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Petra is transitioning between Prague and Frankfurt on ever to be delayed Lufthansa flights. So unfortunately, she cannot be here today with us, but I'm excited to present this early work with her and look forward to your comments. So this is a joint paper, so we submitted a draft, and certainly this is a work in progress. So the thing we would like to explore, or we're exploring in this paper, is an issue why the ratification of the Istanbul Convention failed in the Czech Senate in January 2024. And the paper is called Kill the Bill, How Polish Ordo Juris Swayed the Ratification in the Czech Senate. And it's an example in which we think we have a pretty good evidence to show that the advocacy of a socially conservative organization or network in a neighboring country, in fact, tipped the scales during the voting procedure. So just to summarize what the early draft is about, the Czech Republic signed Istanbul Convention in 2016, but there is a two-step procedure in which you need to ratify it as well. And the ratification was scheduled to be voted on January 24, 2024, and it was expected to be a very smooth sailing because the current governing coalition, which is sort of liberal, sort of progressive, sort of, but definitely pro-Western, this was their electoral promise. They submitted this to the bill. They controlled very comfortably the upper chamber. So the issue is not salient, important in the country, but to everybody's big surprise, this vote failed. And we basically ask why, and we identified two factors. One is domestic. Of course, this was at the end a vote of the Czech political elite, but we also show that we really think that the Ordo Juris' transnational advocacy tipped the scales, and we have evidence, and Ordo Juris even boasts about this, that it launched targeted, very strong campaign that at the end changed vote. And the Polish Conservative Legal Network in itself, they issued statements both in English and in Polish in which they boast about the fact that they prevented the ratification. The ratification didn't fail because most senators voted against it. Most senators actually voted for the ratification, but it failed to reach the quorum. So it was a combination of enabling quite marginal forces in the governing party and the governing coalition. In a way, the culture warriors came out of woodwork, so that gave them sort of weaponized them. But at the end, the campaign and the emails and the advocacy behind the doors really made a big difference. So at the end, the debate in the Senate and vote turned a relatively non-controversial issue into a culture war, and it empowered a small but vocal socially conservative faction in the ruling coalition. We also think, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, would love to know if anyone knows about it, we think this is the first evidence or first case where Ordo Juris, a Polish organization, was actually able to change policy and a bill in a different country. So many of you probably are familiar with the Istanbul Convention. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a two-step process, signature and ratification. It is a human rights treaty open for signature in Turkey in 2011. Those were the days. This little map shows countries that ratified it and signed it. It's a human rights convention of the Council of European Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. It is primarily a convention against domestic violence, broadly defined, but we all know from data that domestic violence disproportionately affects women, and it is viewed as actually a convention against violence against women. It has become a contested issue in Eastern Europe and in many countries. It has been contested, and social conservative networks, domestic social conservative networks, have been mobilized in Armenia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, in Hungary, and Slovakia. Actually, the ratification failed as well, but it can be attributed to the advocacy of local domestic conservative networks. Poland, which is the home of Ordo Juris, signed and then ratified the convention in 2015. Ordo has always been very unhappy about it. It's an eyesore, and they led efforts to de-ratify the convention, but they failed. And then when the Lone Justice Party lost power, this is at this moment a closed door unless they pull a Turkey on it, in which Turkey actually ratified it and pulled out. So we think, or there's evidence to see that the vote in January 2024 in the Czech Republic, a neighboring country, give ordo iuris in a way an opening to change a policy in the country next door. So ordo iuris is a very powerful and I think among the circles that are attending this conference probably known non-governmental pro-life organization. It was established in 2013. It is not a branch of the church. It is a faith-based legal organization. In its own words, it gathers academics and legal practitioners with the aim of promoting a legal culture based on respect for human dignity and rights. Ordo iuris is phenomenal, and this is how they did it in the Czech case. They write recommendations for politicians, they present talking points, they prepare legal expertise, open letters and petitions, and this is, as we sort of show in the paper, or some of it is still, we're still working on it. They use this to sway the vote in the Czech Senate. It is also, I think, quite well established that ordo iuris has very successful influence domestic Polish politics in the area of abortion in 2016. Also, they meddled into a bill that criminalizes comprehensive sexuality education in Poland, bill that restricts in vitro fertilization, and they also advocated for a creation of LGBTQ free zones in Poland, especially in cities that were controlled by the Law and Justice Party. So again, they have been on a mission for quite some time within Poland, but they got an opening in early 2024 in the Czech Republic to kill the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, at least next door, if they failed to do so at home. So this is basically the main outcome of the paper, which is the vote in the Czech Senate in January 2024. As I mentioned, the issue here was not that the majority voted against it. Actually, 34 senators voted for the ratification, but the quorum was 36, and so it failed the vote by 2 points. Just to give you a preview, before the ratification, most Czech public doesn't know what the Istanbul Convention is. They don't care. Again, an issue that was not salient, not important, and was an electoral promise that was supposed to be this was supposed to be a rubber stamp by the Senate. So the kill was built by an active opposition, but also what happened during the vote was that there is a portion of 19 senators, none of which actually refrained from voting. So it was killed by a silent vote, but it was also killed by an opposition. And the fact that these 9 senators abstained, they increased the quorum of those present in the room, and sort of these 2 votes actually really tilted the balance, and the country failed to ratify the convention. We also look at, just to give you a preview, we also looked at the split of the governing coalition, which again, the governing coalition, which is pro-Western, reasonable, represents relatively civil and relatively liberal voices in the country, and this was a proposal of the government. You can see from here, number one, that there is a full control of the Senate, but that a lot of the votes that came against the ratification of the Istanbul Convention came from the governing parties, of which there are many, and I will not bore you with that. And also they contributed greatly to the abstention. And so the silent abstention, it's in a way also a very important area. And in the next iteration of the paper, we actually have interviews in which people say we were afraid to vote against it, but we abstained, and we knew by abstaining we will lower the quorum and it's going to fail. So the pitchforks came from out of nowhere. In a vote that was supposed to be a smooth sailing. So what we do in this version of the paper, we look at the debate in the Senate, and we analyze the debate of this in the Senate, and then we also have, or when we did the analysis, but it didn't make it fully to the paper, we also were fortunate enough that we have a large body of emails that were sent to the senators before the vote, and these emails urged them to vote against it or to abstain and advocated against it. So these emails, and again, Ordo has claimed it, were sent with the help of Ordo Juris. They were in Czech, and the talking points in the emails just are remarkably similar to the talking points that were used during the debate on the Senate. So in a way, we classified it first by analyzing the emails, and then we matched sort of these areas that came up during the debate to what was said on the floor. And again, in the next iteration, we sort of want to work more on the correspondence, which just is absolutely mind-blowing. So we identify sort of, as we analyze the debate in the Senate, again, this is also corresponds with the emails in the inboxes of the senators. The debate or the opposition can be classified into three baskets. The first one is the largest one, which is the issue of Istanbul Convention being viewed as breaking traditional gender roles. Again, this was really viewed as a convention that deals with violence against women. The advocates of the denied ratification claim that the Istanbul Convention undermines traditional gender roles and distorts traditional families, and basically by punishing domestic violence, you distort the family. So in a way, it's better if the husband keeps beating the wife, because if the father is the husband or the father is punished, children are deprived of their father. So there is also a lot of fear that men will be criminalized, and then there is also a debate about children being exposed to trans activism. So in a way, this fear of undermining traditional families, traditional gender roles is the largest sort of body of arguments against the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. Then there are also arguments about sovereignty, in which the opponents and the warriors claim that the Istanbul Convention is a Trojan horse, undermining sovereignty, that there is a clash between the domestic and international war, and that it's an import of the EU and gender ideology. And then finally, and again, I think this is not commonly cited, but especially if you read the emails and then look at the transcripts, there are very, very specific examples that show that the Istanbul Convention does not reduce violence against women in countries where it was adopted, and sort of over and over different people cite the same empirical evidence, but also shows up in the emails. What happened before the debate and the way the knives came out is that the Minister of Justice, who represents the governing party, the Civic Democratic Party, which is supported by relatively liberal voters who support in general who were supportive of this. His job was to come to the floor of the Senate, present the position of the government, which was to ratify the convention and then go home, or advocate for it. So he spent 3 sentences in just describing the convention, but the rest of his opening remarks was a huge rant and an opposition to the bill on the grounds of its futility and effectiveness, and he viewed the bill even deranged. So in a way, but his name is Petr Blažek. He represents, he used some of the talking points, and he represents sort of the segment of the very conservative, very marginal faction in the Civic Democratic Party and in the ruling coalition that was incredibly emboldened by this campaign, and that in a way smelled blood and was able to reverse the vote, or sort of to prevent the ratification of the convention. This is mostly in Czech. This is an example of one of the emails that was received by a female Czech senator. It's a pretty patronizing email with some terrible spelling mistakes. But in this email, actually, she's being encouraged to vote no, of course. And the argument in the email is that family consists of a mother and father and their children. It's a cornerstone of the future. And so if she votes no, then she's sort of undermining the fabric of the Czech society. And so we also have evidence through some interviews that there was some backdoor advocacy where the talking points prepared by Ordo Juris were used by both domestic conservative networks. Again, Ordo didn't, came from the skies to do this. This was a joint effort, but again, we think Ordo really made the difference at the end of the day. And so the debate on the floor and the emails very closely correspond to each other. So to conclude, we actually end up with a country that by Eastern European standards is reasonable, liberal, civil, one would even say a tiny bit progressive. But now it's an anomaly because it's one of the countries that signed the Istanbul Convention but didn't ratify it. So it joins the ranks of Armenia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia. Turkey withdrew from ratification in 2021. It is also a case where the liberal governing coalition failed to deliver on its electoral promise, which will probably bite them back. But this sort of concerted, very effective and very robust campaign gave rise to culture warriors from a marginal faction of the governing party. There are some, culture warriors in the Czech Senate that were obvious, but new people came out, and also through abstention, some people, because they were afraid they would be punished in the future by not ratifying, they remained silent, and in a way, it's the silence that eventually killed this. So this was a targeted campaign that seemingly came out where we think, or we would like to show, that transnational activism of Ordo Juris tipped the scales in an issue that tipped the scales in the direction in which the vote is not reflective of the position of the voters of the governing coalition. Certainly not even the Civic Democratic Party is not aligned with the platforms. It fails to promise. So we think, and again, I'm happy to be corrected, this is the first instance of Ordo Juris successfully shaping policy and laws abroad, speaks to the rising effectiveness of transnational networks, and we think that probably their appetite is going to grow because Ordo is very, very proud and happy about this success. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
So much, Lenka. Last but not least, Julian Waller with the title "Another World is Possible: Eastern European States as Illiberal Exemplar Regime."
The mic is very quiet. Can you guys hear me? All right. Hello, everyone. Julian Waller. I teach Russian politics here at GW. I also work for a government research institute, but that work is entirely separate. This paper is currently in the middle of a revise and resubmit, so I'm eager for any thoughts on this. It's part of a broader set of papers looking at a liberal phenomenon both in Eastern Europe and in Europe generally, as well as in North America, in the Americas overall, and looking at sort of network ties between them. So this paper is entitled "Another World is Possible: Eastern European States as Illiberal Exemplar Regimes." So I will talk as briefly as I possibly can. Gulnaz, please yell at me when we get to 15 minutes. Hopefully we'll go quick. We're going to talk about a few things. The paper, we're going to situate illiberalism very, very quickly. We'll talk about illiberal transnational learning and various dynamics, and we will attempt to show some growing, evolving, and diverse connections between illiberal actors in Eastern Europe and those in the New World. As we all know, at this conference, there are illiberal enemies everywhere. The last 2 decades has been the introduction of this new scholarly term, illiberalism. Many people have different conceptions and understandings. It's often used to describe what amounts to a rogues gallery of bad actors, from Orban to Law and Justice in Poland, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Meloni, Trump, whoever. One important question, given that this illiberal term kind of emerged inductively out of regional research, as well as Fritz Garia's old work on illiberal democracy many decades ago, is how should we use this in a scholarly sense? How should we conceptualize it? And how we should avoid just using illiberal as a pejorative, right? It's very easy to just say that that's the bad thing, right? Zach was mentioning earlier about fascism as a term. Fascism actually has a variety of conceptual definitions. It's also the term you use when you don't like someone. So exactly, how do we want to do something more systematic and rigorous when thinking about illiberalism? This builds off of work by Marlene as well. And also, how do we think about this in broader comparative perspective? So through some papers, I put together a working definition of, I think, what we're talking about. It derives from Marlene's work as well on illiberalism. Now, it's very dangerous to throw out a definition of illiberalism into a group of scholars on illiberalism, knowing very well that at least 4 to 10 of you have your own working definitions of illiberalism. What I will say, and I won't even read the big clunky definition, but what I will argue and use illiberal as is essentially a modern ideological reaction to the perceived experience of hegemonic liberalism from a political, economic, and or social perspective. Again, that dovetails fairly well with Zach's opening keynote and many of the other papers presented here. The key is that when we want to think about illiberalism, we have to think of it in a broad family resemblance approach. The concept is operating at a high level of abstraction, right? We don't mean all of the same thing. What we mean is a phenomenon of reaction with substantive components within. Oftentimes they're regionally bound or country level bound, or even bound differently depending on the actor. Therefore, describing something as illiberal only tells us so much. We need to be more specific. This is an effort to provide some specificity. When we compare illiberalism in its sort of locus or genus point in East Central Europe, we find a very, very interesting and well-developed phenomenon. Illiberalism in Eastern Europe is actor-driven. It is government-oriented. The reasons why we have this term in the first place is because of Hungary and because of Poland. That's mostly inductively where we're deriving a lot of our focus on illiberalism. And this is a rich part of the world for reaction to take place. The ideological toolbox in Eastern Europe is in general quite wide. Not only are illiberal political orientations fairly usual in the population, as well as among large sections of the elite, but it is consonant with older standard ideological traditions and ideologies that pre-exist democratization, pre-exist communism in many ways. We can think of harder forms of conservatism broadly defined, the long-standing legacy of statist right-wing politics in these countries, as well as older forms of Christian democratic or Christian social political party movements, right? So it's a nice, rich place. You can grab a lot of traditions from the interwar era, even from the 19th century, things you read about in your textbook, and say, well, this is, of course, part of our legacy, part of our traditions. The other aspect of illiberalism in Eastern Europe is that it's quite institutionalized, with institutionalized parties, political organizations, a strong non-liberal civil society that operates in each of these countries. And all of that creates a variety of mechanisms of intellectual and political elite circulation through universities, foundations, government, thought collectives, as others have argued, which means that, again, not only is there an ideologically rich tradition to draw on, but there's an institutionally rich ecosystem and environment from which you can build out, from which you can become socialized, and from which you can get positions in education, in society, and so on. And finally, the other aspect of illiberalism in East Central Europe that's particularly interesting is a relatively pragmatic approach to politics, because at the end of the day, the goal is political power, right? Achieving office in government, however you can, through elections, which is going to create its own set of incentive structures. We often talk about these parties as being especially far right, but in many cases, they are not the farthest right party in their respective party systems. These are, in fact, essentially mainstream right-wing parties. Now, the mainstream we might consider to be beyond the pale, but nevertheless, it's not strange within the context. Okay, that's Eastern Europe. But does it travel? Hungary and Poland are these sort of two core exemplar cases of relatively successful and sustained illiberal politics. But do other illiberal actors, illiberal intellectuals, illiberal politicians elsewhere in the world Do they care? Does it matter to them? So the paper's research question is, in what ways do illiberal politics in Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, influence or inform ideological production, transnational networks, and elite cadres in other regions? I use the Anglo-American world, the English-speaking world, and Latin America as sort of a shadow set of cases, and I focus on sort of core elements of distinct illiberal thought in these worlds, from post-liberalism to national conservatism to the broader hard right or the dissident right, and even sort of explicitly authoritarian strains of thought, all of which we should consider to be at least potentially distinct. I want to bring up perhaps the most famous and effective right-wing activist in the United States, Chris Rufo. He wrote last year in the Red Brownist Journal Compact about a trip to Hungary. He says, "My deepest interest was to understand how Hungary, which emerged from Soviet communism just 30 years ago, is attempting to rebuild its culture and institutions from schools to universities to media. They are not pursuing the path of maximum laissez-faire, but using muscular state policy to achieve conservative ends." Again, Rufo is probably the most successful activist in the United States today on the conservative side, an advisor to Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, an advisor to the Trump campaign as well. He's talking about Little Hungary. This is not only Chris Rufo, there's actually an entire ecosystem of illiberal, of harder right, English speaking, English language, publications, books, networks, conferences that exist. And I don't mean to put this together in sort of a conspiratorial framework. We're not connecting the dots on some board. What I'm suggesting is that we are starting to get specific network ties from what is a relatively backwater part of the Anglo-American imaginary to core politics here. So in the paper, I suggest there are 3 vectors of illiberal ideational diffusion coming from Eastern Europe to the New World. I suggest we can divide these into 3 different camps: intellectual learning, policy borrowing, and institutional imitation. Intellectual learning is gaining new insights and viewpoints previously unknown or unexpressed systematically. Policy borrowing is direct reference to policy models and approaches developed elsewhere. And institutional imitation is conscious efforts to mimic the forms and orientations of parties or actors abroad. And there's a variety of different potential applications. So I'll just very quickly run through the variation in how these travel to the English and Spanish-speaking world, Spanish and Portuguese, I suppose. On the Anglo-American side, on the English language side of things, it's a fairly rich display of different influences coming from Eastern Europe to the West. Intellectually, a major actor of import is Ryszard Legutko, a Polish intellectual, Polish MEP. He has a very famous book, The Demon in Democracy. This is widely cited across illiberal actors in English-speaking countries, in Britain, as well as in the United States. It's in fact, in many ways, a foundational book. In illiberal circles, almost everyone has read Pat Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, and almost everyone has read The Demon in Democracy. This is the level of influence, and this is new. That has not previously been the case. Second, national conservatism as a practical political ideology. Illiberals in the Anglo-American world are desperately seeking to move away from what they would call right liberalism, right, or the laissez-faire approach, the free market approach. And what they've found is that Eastern European forms of national conservatism or national democratic movements, or whatever you'd like to call it, seem to be a useful model. And you see this again very, very clearly through much of their writing. Finally, there's cults of various sort of intellectuals that have Eastern European connections, including the British Roger Scruton, so on and so forth. In terms of policy borrowing, we see quite heavily an emphasis on family policy, on the normalization of the welfare state and state spending, state activity. And there is some discussion of party building, but it's fairly weak. I'll discuss at the very end. In terms of institutional imitation, in many ways, Hungary is to the illiberal right in the United States, at least, as Sweden is to the progressive left wing as well. But there's also a variety of public outreach networks, including a variety of publications, think tanks based in Hungary, and Ordo Juris, the judicial network. Okay. On the Latin American side, this was harder to find. And in fact, one reason for this is that it seems that local illiberal traditions or right-wing traditions are relatively preferred. Part of this is very likely due to the more less hegemonically liberal historical background of Latin American countries, which makes it less necessary in sort of the marketplace of ideas to look out of area in order to find figures to emulate or things to learn, right? Similarly, in policy borrowing, we also have some difficulty. And in many cases in Latin America, the sort of right liberal or laissez-faire or libertarian aspects of Anglo-American conservative politics is actually much more specified. You see this in Milei, for example, in Argentina. And finally, in terms of exemplar institutional imitation, in Latin American cases, you often find sort of generic international conservative alliances, often oriented to the Catholic Church. And there are some network ties that do exist, for example, between Jose Antonio Cast, conservative candidate for president of Chile, and Ordo Juris, and various other Polish pro-life organizations, family values organizations, and so on. Taking this holistically, what we find is that in terms of relative emphases, because not everything that Orban does or that PiS did is taken equally by Chris Rufo or someone like that. The focus is on moral cultural issues and on state assertive approaches, bringing the state back in. So there's a variety of ways that focuses from family values, traditionalism, respect for religion, respect for Christianity, and of course the concern for migration, although that's overdetermined because that's happening everywhere. There's also a public focus on pragmatic network building and elite development. So increasingly there are conferences hosted in Eastern Europe for Americans and Brits and Canadians to come and visit, and vice versa. They will come here. CPAC, which I believe is the heading of our program, is one example. NatCon conference is also another example in which you can have networking. And finally, there is a point of interest, a sustained point of interest in statism, the use of state power or muscular state power as politically legitimate, which is a change from, again, the traditional American conservative approach. If you take, say, the Reaganite fusionism as the baseline. Perhaps most interestingly, and I think some people would be surprised at this one, is there is less interest in the public writing of illiberal figures in both of these places in authoritarian rule for its own sake, right? Talking in terms of authoritarianism, it's something that Zach mentioned, that we still live in the age of democracy. People still frame things in terms of democracy. Most specifically, there's relatively little interest in modeling the forms of competitive authoritarianism that you see in Hungary, that some would argue was attempted in Poland, in the American context, in the British context, or in Latin American contexts, right? There's relatively little focus on the party building aspect, on the institutionalization aspect, the ways in which autocratization took place. There's also relatively little public focus on hard forms of autocratization as well. That's not to say you can't find it on Twitter, or you can't find some very spicy writings. But I have a different paper on authoritarian theorists proper. When that is present, when you have illiberal actors who specifically say, you know what, democracy is terrible, I want an autocracy, I want an authoritarian regime, they don't focus on Eastern European cases. They focus on analogies to Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal. They focus on analogies to Republican Rome. They do not look at Orban as the model of autocratization. It's actually a very important distinction because they are looking very carefully. Okay, so concluding thoughts, and I will be done. Illiberal learning, borrowing, and imitation aren't just simple unidirectional aspects. They're going to be informed by context, local interest. If we wanted to sum up some of the findings, Eastern European examples are far more integrated into illiberal thought in the Anglo-American world than they are in Latin America. I would be interested in people from Latin American countries to sort of poke into that a little bit more. I'm open to the idea that I have not read enough. Relatively speaking, however, from what I've found, Latin American forms of illiberalism much more tied to specific contexts and to historical forms of non-liberal thought. Again, there is a great richness of non-liberal tradition in Latin America in the way that there is in Eastern Europe, in a way that there might not be in the United States, at least not in the same way in Great Britain. Direct interest in illiberal states as examples of authoritarianism proper, relatively absent, again, as I noted. And finally, I think the biggest development of the last 5, maybe 10 years is that illiberal states in Eastern Europe are becoming sort of generic visions of other ways that society can be. Another world is possible was in fact the name of an illiberal conference. Hungary is this idealized right-wing Sweden, and it shows proof of concept that it doesn't have to be this way. Okay, with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Just using the position as a chair, I think I would ask one question to whole panel and then open up to the rest of the audience. So do please prepare to raise your hand so that the mic can also travel across the room. Yeah, I wonder to what extent you guys and those who are also joining us online think maybe the framework of Cold War can help to maybe also shift a little bit our lenses in terms of, and to what extent do you think it is helpful? Because on the one hand, there is ideological confrontation, it seems, where liberalism is challenged by another alternative ideology coming also from, again, mostly Eastern Europe. So we were talking a little bit about where it is interestingly, the challenge comes again from very Western Eurocentric perspectives. So we have been talking that after the end of the Cold War, Islamism emerged as this confrontation to liberalism, which would be indeed something really outside of Western Eurocentric paradigm, but in the end, it seems like it now gave way to something, again, very Euro and Western centric, where again, there's a shared root, very similar to socialism and liberalism in the 20th century. And also that there is a very political, geopolitical, global dimension to it, where it seems that the global south also uses this confrontation to play in. So Julian was talking a little bit indeed about the borrowing and then learning, where it seemed that still some of the things are very much pragmatism driven. And this is also what Hadas in her presentation have been mentioning. But I will just leave this question there. So see you guys if you feel like answering, or maybe this is too big of a question to ask, and then I will just see if there are people in the room who would like to ask. We'll probably will collect at least like 3 questions. So let's start with Piri and Mike's. Yeah. So here 2 questions in this row.
Thank you. Perrine Scheer from the University of Rouen in France, and also a non-resident fellow at GW. I have a question. Can I have 2 questions?
Short, please.
2 small questions.
We don't have a lot of time, so please do.
Okay, I have a question for Maria and I have a question for Julian. So Maria, you mentioned that the traditional family ideology was mainly present in the Eastern and Central European socio-cultural themes. So my question was, why is it not that present in Western European? Is it because they don't subscribe to it? Or is it because they hide it better? So we'll keep it to this. And for Julian, my question was that you mentioned 3 vectors of illiberal diffusion. One of them was the intellectual learnings. And so you mentioned an essay, so for example, the one by Legutko. My question was, is there intellectual learning from things that are not directly political? For example, can you find intellectual learnings from something out of politics, for example, from fiction, from novels, from movies? So this would be my question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. I'm Arsenio Cuenca from the École Pratique des Hautes Études à Paris, and I'm doing a PhD also using illiberalism as a concept to study ideology. And the comment I wanted to put on the table, because I think that we're here also to enrich the field of studies through different approaches of what has been discussed. Only if we think of that a family is a group of people that doesn't like each other, that doesn't see each other that much, and that they do not have the best relation, can we think of illiberalism as a family? Because the problem of embodying illiberalism in these kind of actors is that we tend to forget that and it will be discussed during the conference, we're going to talk about left-wing or allegedly left-wing illiberalism. We're going to talk about opposition movements to illiberal regimes who develop illiberal practices. So I really think that, and Maria, you express, you use this expression illiberal toolkit in the document you submitted. I think we have to think of illiberalism in this sense, as ideology, as discourse, as narratives, as a toolkit that different actors are going to use in order to fulfill their opportunistic, ideological, political, whatever purposes. That's it. Thank you.
Please pass the mic at the end of the row.
My question's for Julian. My name's Lucy Hamilton. I'm from the University of Technology in Sydney, and I'm working on the Australian interaction amongst the Hungarian and other things. You suggested you wanted to resist the conspiracist thing, but we're noticing in Australia that there's a big overlap with the Atlas Network heritage sort of people. Are you suggesting that's more coincidental and shared interests than strategic?
Thank you. Please, speakers, provide responses.
Thank you very much. Excellent conversation. We're very grateful. So this is a big question that you asked, but I think like my previous studies of illiberalism, mostly focusing the far right and populist right parties, primarily finds them being quite reactionary. So they seek for an opening and they fill in, and at that, in doing so, they end up being quite opportunistic. Having said that, again, since I focus mostly on the economic dimension, it's clear that the mainstream in corresponding society did create those openings, right? Indeed, there was, so when we, kind of reject this claim of liberal hegemony, it's also important to keep in mind that there was indeed a lot of convergence happening between the mainstream parties, which left behind a lot of modernization losers, for example, who then became unhappy about it and were incorporated by this party. So in that sense, I think the key to them is this reactionary nature that also finds its ground at the grassroots level. That's how I would answer. But clearly, there's much more, and the phenomenon is emerging. So it's possible that this used to be true, but not true anymore. One particular, at least so far, consistent finding, whether you study economic or even social political offering of this or toolkit of these parties, they are not really able to provide a radical alternative. So in that sense, they remain a function to the political liberal mainstream, even if they do offer some adjustment and they're increasingly growing in popularity. But they haven't yet cracked it. They don't really know what it is that they're offering. Based on my analysis. Great question on the family values. Well, first of all, that's a working hypothesis, right? Because this is just a setup. We haven't even really done the analysis. Maybe we had to find out that the family values are indeed emphasized by the Western parties as well. But again, based on my previous research, what I can tell you is that East and West illiberal parties differ in the composition of the electorates. East Central European reality is that up to 60% of the electorates are still working classes, and those occupied in industrial work, and that brings about more traditional orientations. I imagine it is much harder to sell, a woman's traditional position role in the society in the countries which have moved beyond that. So there's just fewer, I would imagine, groups that are more susceptible to those narratives as opposed to more traditional societies in East Central Europe. But then again, this is just a hypothesis. I stand to be corrected.
Julian?
Sure. Hello. Okay, there's a bunch of questions here. First, on intellectual learning that's not coming from just political sources. I think, so yes, for sure. And I think where the inroad is not so much, in most cases, literature, it's in nonfiction. So it's in biographies, and it's in histories and historical narratives that are coming out of both Eastern Europe. I have actually in mind a Russian case. Pyotr Wrangel from the Russian Civil War. He has a book called Always with Honor. Always with Honor is regularly circulated among illiberal groups in the United States. You see it on Twitter all the time, republished, retranslated by a sort of a far-right publisher. And it's all about sort of, facing up to your destiny despite overwhelming odds and all of that. Similarly, so Ernst Junger's work is also circulating quite widely. It's Germany, so not quite East Central Europe in the same way that we're talking about. Or you can even look in the very mundane sense of those very long Twitter threads with like some little like insight from history or like classical architecture or whatever, which is again very popular and touches in the same sort of socio-demographic group from which is also reading illiberal intellectuals in the United States, who also know who Roger Scruton is, who know who Adrian Vermeule is, who know who various actors are. So I think that's kind of the answer. Is it's actually more in history. The Hungarian Revolution anniversary just happened today, and I saw a ton of stuff on Hungary specifically. And on the fight against communism. One of my cases of an actual American authoritarian theorist, Charles Haywood, who writes a very widely cited blog where he just reviews books. He has Hungarian descent. And so he's very interested in the Hungarian question in particular. He's exactly one of those people who would like, I don't want to build Orban's regime, I want to build Franco's regime to start. So anyway, that's the long answer. But yes, I think that's where the non-political energy is coming from. In terms of strategic versus coincidental, what I really meant when I said we don't want to go into conspiracy is that some of this, we have to understand that we should try not to pathologize over much, right? So for example, the fact that the Heritage Foundation has connections with other advocacy groups in other countries, it's unclear to me why that's strange or weird, right? Given that a variety of think tanks have advocacy and network connections on different parts of the spectrum. So I think it's the question is, why wouldn't they? Shouldn't we expect that? Shouldn't we expect interactions between sort of think tanks and funding groups and things like that? It's important to sort of descriptively identify it and see what sort of projects they're interested in or narratives that they're putting forward. A big case in the literature is always the World Congress of Families, which sponsors lots of anti-LGBT legislation, has a lot of connections both in Russia and in sub-Saharan Africa, and is associated with conservative evangelical as well as Catholic groups. You can be normatively against that, but it doesn't mean that it's weird they're doing what they're doing, right? They believe things and they want those things to happen, and the leverage point is going to happen in certain countries, right? Especially because it's not happening necessarily in their home country. So I just think that's what I intended on that. I'd be interested in hearing more about your work. That sounds extremely interesting. And finally, riffing off of something that Maria said about sort of these illiberal groups are reacting to the fact that there really was a degree of consensus in the 1990s and the 2000s and even into the 2010s. I think Zach actually brought up a really good point with Liz Cheney appearing with Kamala Harris to denounce Trump and say, it's terrible and horrible. That is both a defense of democracy. She's doing it on procedural grounds. It also feeds directly into the narrative among illiberals in the United States, or even not even illiberals, just sort of conservatives or people on the center right, that there is a de facto what they would call the uniparty, right? That in fact the left and the right are the same institutionally, that it's a conspiracy, and that we can never win. And so Cheney showing up to support Harris or Vice President Dick Cheney endorsing her is indeed a sign that their narrative is correct, right? It's an empirical observation on their account. And I've already seen some of that. So anyway, it's just interesting how the reaction can be expressed and what data points they would use to sort of point to it.
Thank
I
you.
probably missed something, but we want to get to more questions.
Let's collect more questions. Indeed, there was one question over there, and then over there, and two ladies at the back, please.
Yeah, just a very quick comment, Julian. Very much appreciated your project. Regarding the Latin American connection, because I'm also working a little bit on these topics and with the focus on Latin America. And I think recent developments would help to establish a stronger connection to Europe in general, especially like political events, right? Like, for example, Vox or Santiago Abascal is a crucial figure in the connection between East and Western Europe and Latin America. So I would maybe encourage to look a little bit at political developments in that context. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there is one question over here.
Hi, Francisco. I'm a GW alum and also Latin Americanist. I really appreciated Julian's focus on network effects. In other spaces, there have been discussions about how the evangelical movement in the US has reached out to other regions of the world. But increasingly, I find that the conservative movement is leveraging their political machinery to also, I would say, build up capacity in Latin America. Specific example, CPAC, I was surprised to find out last year started their first Mexico edition. And just a couple months ago, they launched their second edition of CPAC Mexico. So this is a project that they are clearly investing long-term. I want to just reference some language that's on their website. They say CPAC Mexico openly identifies as a conservative movement. They say that in the face of social and political socialism, we unite forces to protect what is most precious to us, God, country, and family. I did not attend this space, but I do feel that this answers part of your question of like what is happening in Latin America to share resources, share knowledge, share policy recommendations. Do you want to could you elaborate on some specific examples where you're seeing network effects between the conservative movement in the US and Latin American counterparts? Thank you.
There are two questions at the back.
Hello, Natasha Kervenek, École de hautes études en sciences sociales, Paris. I have a question to Lenka Bustikova, but she's not there.
No, she's still here.
Okay. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I'm very interested in Ordo Iuris because it's also the subject of my study I will present tomorrow. And I suppose several organizations, including Progressive, were involved in this ratification debate of Istanbul Convention. And I'd like to know what is the reason of the successful advocacy of this particular organization? How, in your opinion, they built their legitimacy with political leaders in Czech Republic? Have you detected some personal connection with them, or maybe with local conservative organization that act as brokers with local political leaders? Is just a question of the successful use of rhetorical tools, of, I don't know, reappropriation of human rights rhetoric, or yeah, what's your opinion? Thank you.
Hi, Anemona Constantin. I'm a fellow at the Center for the Study of Political Life, Free University of Brussels. And I also had a question for Lenka Bustikova, which goes in the same sense. I was curious, I don't know if she hears me.
Lenka, can you hear us? Yes.
Yes. If you could tell us more about the illiberal scene, I mean the local factors that explain the successful reception of the Ordo Iuris intervention in the Czech Republic, because as far as I know, there is a small but very active illiberal scene in the Czech Republic. I'm thinking to Tomio Kamura, SPD, and to some mainstream intellectuals who are very sensitive to the new French right, to Alain de Benoit, etc. So if you could tell us more about this? And the second question was for Julian and Maria. How do you build these categories of East and West? And what do you do with the transnational networks? Because as far as I know, these two regions are not are in interaction, and they are building themselves in relationship towards one another. I'm speaking from the Eastern point of view. They are in competition, and I had the impression in your presentation that they are kind of separate. So, thank you.
Thank you, Nimona. We will start with Lenka. Lenka, could you please respond to the questions?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Also, I want to mention that Petra Guasti, who is, a co-author on the paper, joined us. So we will split the questions a bit, and I will just say two things, and then Petra will take over. So she has a chance to comment a little bit on this, and also she knows much more about some of these things than I do. I would say the progressive advocacy in the Czech Republic failed in this respect. Unfortunately, I think the convention failed. We made a decision. We actually discussed this quite a bit with Petra, that we will not analyze the advocacy for the Istanbul Convention. We will just focus on killing the bill. But obviously, you see sort of parallel processes on both sides. But something that was mentioned in the presentations over and over again, the right wing is so much better at this and so much more effective, and that's why we want to write this paper, to show how good they are. And so I will leave the rest to Petra. I would say the illiberal scene is fragmented. The Ordo Iuris was going at it from multiple directions. And so certainly you need, at the end, every vote is a domestic vote. But we just wanted to say how incredibly effective they were in mobilizing the social conservative scene in the Czech Republic, which, there is an element of the far right, but I think one has to be really very careful about trafficking between the far right and socially conservative circles, because these are two different things. You can have far right that is not socially conservative. I mean, maybe less and less so, but just like intellectually, one has to be able to disaggregate these two aspects, because a lot of the family policies in Eastern Europe traditionally have been actually remarkably progressive. For example, the family law in the Czech Republic in 1953 would blow up the mind of, most progressives in the West, and I think the Baltics. So I just think that the illiberal scene is not necessarily a socially conservative scene, even though in this paper we focus on that. And I will leave the rest to Petra to really answer the question. Yes.
Thank you. So what I would just like to add that to Ordo Iuris, so basically it was an all direction assault, so both top down through connections with elites, bottom up through email campaign. So some of the emails are inauthentic. We are trying to find a way to systematically analyze that, but they're like, if they have the same typos, we know that that kind of this was a copy paste. I agree what Lenka has said. The illiberal scene is multifaceted and fragmented, mostly fragmented due to personal animosities, not because of ideological disagreements. And basically, this is a group which is competing for a relatively small share of the electorate. So this is another point I wanted to raise. And so, of course, these groups are both inside and outside of parliament. But what we are most interested in here is to look at the radicalized elements within mainstream parties and how the mainstream parties are coping with it. And this weekend, the Christian Democrats had a Congress, and I just skimmed through. I had enough people writing me what the proposals are. So you would see that there is a very loud but very small group within that party that is trying to kind of sway for power. But it's still a minority. And a final point I wanted to make is just by nature of legislative process, it's much easier to maintain status quo and prevent adoption of something than to actually adopt a law. And the very final sentence on this is that what they are amazing in, the illiberals, they're really good with the parliamentary procedures. So they know the rules and they work the rules and they work the system. And so the call is coming from inside of the house. And I think this is a very important point for all of us to look at. Thank you.
And thank you, Lenka. We're at the limit of our panel, so if you guys, Maria and Julian, could just very briefly respond to the questions that were posed to you.
I mean, it's really just one West versus East. It's my favorite question because it's the only time I get this question is from somebody from the Eastern Europe. I'm sorry. It's just, I think it just flags the existence of those divides. And for better or worse, right, that we have the very painful historical legacy in case of Europe, where part of the Europe was under a long, almost quasi-imperial control of Russia. And that per se shaped the legacies in this context in a way that's different from the West, even if at the same time we obviously see convergence, and identifying this convergence is actually one of the ideas underlying our research. So we're totally fine with claiming that they're not different, but so far, nonetheless, parties appear to be different in the platforms they adopt, and part of that precisely given this variation in the legacies, given the prevalence of these mnemonic words, specifically for Eastern Central European context, which is less of a thing in the West. And so that's precisely the question that I'm going to pursue. Are there indeed these distinct Eastern Western European parties, or are they not?
Okay, one thing. Talk about CPAC Mexico. We'll talk about the Latin American connections. Very quickly, it's extremely clear that they are mutually reinforcing and they're going in both directions. And it's going through evangelicalism, and it's going through Pentecostalism, and it's going through the fact that we now have generations of immigrants from various Latin American countries who have family back home. And they're both on the same WhatsApp group sometimes, and there's all these articles about Brazilian WhatsApp groups being very strong supporters of Bolsonaro. Well, a lot of those readers are actually living in California, or they're living in New Mexico or something like that, or they're living in suburban Virginia, and they're going back and forth. And so I think that's part of the network effect. Is actually there's a demographic network effect. There's a unity, a single language unity of intellectual connections. There's familial connections, and there's connections through a particular form of Christianity, which is highly charismatic, highly dependent on personal connections and relations, and interested in evangelization specifically, and so always interested in outreach and infrastructure building at the local community level. And so CPAC Mexico is kind of this sort of bigger, higher level party thing going on at the top, but a lot of really interesting network effects are actually happening at the grassroots level.
With apologies for those whose questions I couldn't ask, please use the coffee break to ask them